An epidural. If you are pregnant, I can almost guarantee that at least one person has asked you if you're planning on getting an epidural. I know that when I was pregnant with my son, I was asked that question probably at least 20 times. And at least in the beginning, I really had no idea. I didn't know much about epidurals beyond the fact that about 60% of women in the United States get one. So I knew there was probably something to it, but to be able to make an educated decision for myself, I wanted to learn more. And so of course, as a childbirth prep educator and doula, I have supported hundreds of women that have chosen to get one or have chosen to not get one. I have seen them administered. So, to help you make that decision, I'm going to give you kind of the lowdown on what an epidural does, how it is administered. And so, an epidural, it is going to cause almost complete numbness from the waist down. You typically will not be able to walk at all. Some women still have a little bit of movement, but not much. And the idea is that it essentially eliminates pain from contractions. A lot of times, women can still feel a bit of pressure during the contractions, but a lot of that pain is entirely or at least mostly eliminated. So to get an epidural, what happens is, of course, you need to let the care provider know. They'll let the anesthesiologist know. If the anesthesiologist has, a waiting list, it might take a while, half an hour, maybe even more for them to get to you. But once they do, what will happen is you will be given about 1 to 2 liters of IV fluid. And then the anesthesiologist will come in. Usually they will have you kind of bend forward. They will numb a space in your lower abdomen where they will insert the epidural. And then what they do is they insert a needle that's threaded through a catheter, very, very thin one, and they insert it into what's called the epidural space. So an epidural is not actually inserted into your spinal cord. The epidural space is just outside the membrane that covers your spinal cord. And this epidural space, the best way to describe it is like a super highway of signals that are being sent to the nerve. So once it's placed and the medication starts flowing, it is blocking those nerve impulses. So your nerves aren't causing pain. They're told to just shut off, essentially, at least from your waist down. So once that little catheter is placed, the needle is taken out, but the catheter remains, and it's just taped to your back, and you are connected to an IV, which gives you the medications that make up the epidural. This is usually a combination of numbing agents and some opioids. Most moms don't feel like really loopy with an epidural. Some feel a little bit of that. And a nice thing with the epidural is those opioids, the medications that make up the epidural aren't going directly into your bloodstream. So the idea is that fewer or less medication actually gets to baby. And again, you don't get that like super out of it feeling, but hopefully almost immediately you'll start to experience some of the numbing sensations. And then after a while, again, you shouldn't really be able to feel anything from your waist down. So that is just the standard epidural. There's also something called a walking epidural, and really the only difference between these two is that you are receiving less medication. So it's not as intense of a numbing sensation. And it's called a walking epidural, but typically women aren't really able to walk around with this type of epidural, but they do have a bit more movement. For example, I supported one mom that had a walking epidural, and she was able to use the squat bar that was put over the hospital bed and actually pull herself up and squat while she was pushing. So that can be, a nice middle ground if you're like, I want some pain relief, but I don't want to be totally numb. But if a walking epidural is something that you're considering, I would talk to your care provider about it well ahead of time, because some hospitals don't provide walking epidurals. So it's nice to know if that will even be an option for you. Okay, so let's get into some of the pros and cons of an epidural, because like so many, interventions, or, even like unmedicated childbirth, there are pros and cons. There's no one right answer. Okay, so some of the pros. So it promotes rest. One of the biggest blocks women come across during childbirth is extreme fatigue. When you are having one contraction after another and they're really strong, it is almost impossible to sleep. So if you have a really, really long labor, you might get completely exhausted, so much so that you just feel like, I can't do this anymore. I won't be able to push. And I've supported women like that. And in their case, an epidural was a great choice. The epidural often allows an exhausted mom to rest, to sleep, to get a really deep sleep. Usually when she wakes up, she's ready to go. A lot of times she dilates pretty quickly after she rests, not all the time, and has more energy to push. So again, it can allow you to rest. It can also help to minimize anxiety. So as the intensity of contractions grows and you're having to manage more and more pain, some women experience the fight, flight, or freeze response. They get really panicked, they're filled with fear, and that can impede the mother's breathing. Baby might start to get less oxygen, it impedes the blood flow to the uterus. So it can turn into a potentially dangerous situation if the mom is really, really panicking. And in this case, an epidural could help her to calm down. It could take away that pain so she can just focus on relaxing and resting, as I mentioned before. Okay, an epidural can also allow for more alertness than other pain medications. So, for example, another pain management tool during childbirth could be, getting something like fentanyl, like a pretty heavy duty opioid, through an IV. And in that situation, the opioid goes directly to the bloodstream. It can be really intense, it can make you feel really out of it. And the thing with that too is it's not necessarily going to numb you from the waist down. So a lot of times women are still feeling the contractions, but they're feeling really out of it, which makes it harder to use, the pain management tools. So a lot of times, and this is just my personal opinion, but if you are going to get a pain management tool that includes medication, I would personally choose an epidural over the other options. But again, that is just my personal opinion. I highly recommend talking to your care provider about what your options are. Okay, some of the risks of an epidural. So a drop in blood pressure, this is one of the most common side effects of an epidural. And this is one reason why you and baby will be continuously monitored after the epidural is monitored or is placed. You will always have monitoring to make sure that you're both good. And with this drop in blood pressure, I've seen it in a positive light as well. I had one mom that came into the hospital and she had really, really high blood pressure. And so an epidural was given to lower that blood pressure, and it worked like a charm. But it can be dangerous in some situations. So again, you will be monitored to make sure that you're all good. Difficulty pushing. So this is another pretty common side effect of an epidural. Because you are for the most part numb from the waist down, it can be really hard to connect with those abdominal muscles, to that natural expulsive reflex, to your perineum, the areas that are supporting you in pushing baby out. I have seen plenty of women with an epidural successfully have that vaginal birth, push the baby out, but it can make it more difficult. Something else is that an epidural could potentially cause what is called a cascade of intervention. And the idea there is that once you have one intervention, you might need another one and then another one. And so in the case of an epidural, sometimes, not always, it can slow down contractions so much so that you might need Pitocin to get things going and again. And in some cases, that Pitocin causes contractions that are so strong that baby might become distressed, leading potentially to the need for a C-section. That certainly does not always happen, but that is a potential side effect of an epidural. Something that is pretty rare is it's called a spinal headache. And this is like it's like a migraine on steroids, a really, really intense headache that could last for weeks. But that is an incredibly rare side effect. If you're concerned about that, ask your care provider for more information about a spinal headache. And other potential side effects are shivering, fever, and itchiness. And if you feel any of those after you get an epidural, of course, let your care provider know if you're feeling itchy, if you're feeling really hot, if you're not feeling great, always let them know. And likely they can support you in remedying whatever side effect you're experiencing. Okay, so those are the pros and the cons of an epidural, but I think another really important component of deciding whether or not you want to get an epidural is educating yourself on unmedicated childbirth as well. When I became pregnant with my son, I just assumed, yeah, I'll get an epidural, but I didn't really know anything about unmedicated birth. I didn't even really know that it was possible. I took a hypnobirthing class. I really got educated on unmedicated childbirth, and I decided that for me, that felt like a better option. And I had that unmedicated birth, but that is not always the best case for all women. So again, you can get educated by, reading different books. I wrote a book on on childbirth preparation that gives all the tools for an unmedicated birth. It's called Feng Shui Mommy. There's other amazing books like the Hypnobirthing book, Birthing Without Fear, Birthing from Within, and then there's classes such as Hypnobirthing, Lamaze, and the Bradley Method that can all help you learn about unmedicated childbirth and give you the tools to have one. So, even if you think, I'm pretty sure I want to have an epidural, I still think it's great to, read some of those books, to take at least one childbirth preparation class, to really feel like you're making an informed decision. And the last, probably most important piece of making this informed decision is talking to your care provider. You might, for example, have a circumstance that means that you cannot get an epidural. Some blood clotting disorders would mean that a mother could not have an epidural. If you're on blood thinning medication, but you really want an epidural, they might have you get off of those. So talk to your care provider about your options. Wishing you a very happy, healthy, empowered birth experience.